Hey, everybody, we're back. Excited to moderate a panel of folks to talk about AI and product strategy. So first, we're going to have Jonathan, who's the founder of Prompt Layer. There he is. Awesome. Jonathan, thanks for joining us. Founder
Thank you
of
for
Prompt
having
Layer
me.
gave a great talk earlier. And you've seen like a lot of interesting use cases for LLMs, like as a part of building out Prompt Layer. And so really excited to have you here and kind of get your insights on the state of things. Next, we're also going to have Allison Pickens. AI-focused investor and former COO of Gainsight. And so really excited to have her perspective, given kind of her background. And then finally, we'll also have awesome. We'll also have Vijay, the director of product at Heap. Heap is doing some interesting things with LLMs and thinking really in a nuanced way about prioritization and things like that. So really excited to have his perspective. Great, thanks for joining us, everybody. So we'll start. Let's start off actually with something Jonathan said in his talk. So Jonathan, you said that like the AI hype is kind of calming down a little bit. And I think there are other kind of signals of this that you've like, aside from what you said. So like, I think I saw a Reuters article about ChatGPT usage being down. I think there's been, some decline of usages for other like AI native startups. So I'm curious, let's start with this. Let's just start with, do folks think that do they agree with Jonathan? Like, do we think that the hype is dying down a little bit, or is this just like some weird seasonality? And maybe so let's start there. Any thoughts on this?
I could dive in a bit. I can't say I'm a macro expert or an expert on trends, but I can share like my sort of limited perspective. I think probably with the ChatGPT usage decline specifically, there's probably some element of seasonality to it with students, taking off the summer. I think students were probably a pretty significant, percentage of total usage. I think there might be a part of this as well, which is that it seems likely that major adoption cycles like this kind of are not linear, but actually are a little bit more bumpy than we would expect, particularly because I think people are trying to figure out how to incorporate LLMs into their workflows. I think that's actually a huge opportunity for the future and for a lot of startups as well, which we could talk more specifics later. But the thing about ChatGPT is that it's a siloed tool. But if I'm trying to use it in my marketing, in creation of content for sales or customer success use cases, there might be more purpose-built tools for that.
Go ahead, Vijay. Yeah, it sounds like something.
I was gonna say just kind of like piggybacking off that. Like, I don't think it was ever a reasonable assumption that like the world was gonna stop using the rest of the internet and only interface through the like information through like a chat window in like ChatGPT. Like I know, especially when they released plugins, like there was like some people who were really hyped about that. But I think like frankly, if you go back to like UX basics, right? Like you don't want to have this high friction experience to give an LLM the right context. And so I think ChatGPT has probably inspired a lot of companies to realize the usefulness of LLMs. And I think we're just getting started on the value of LLMs. And you're right, like a lot of these companies are trying to figure out how to integrate it into their workflows, because that is the easiest way to give the right context to these models to actually get value.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you guys kind of have more of like you think it's like an S-shaped thing. Like it's not like, it's just going to go exponential crazy.
Or like ChatGPT is not a good measure, right? Like I don't think any of us really care about it as like ChatGPT, like daily active users as like a measure of the usefulness of LLMs. I think is like not a useful exercise.
I love it.
I think the primary value of ChatGPT was to educate the broader lay public on what LLMs can do to change their lives. And what's more interesting, I think, is, again, the more like purpose-built applications to come. I think it's likely that a lot of folks got pretty excited about LLMs for a period and started to try out some use cases and then realized that the workflow wasn't sufficient. For example, several months ago, my husband and I decided to geek out on a Saturday night and just like try out Midjourney for the first time. And, if you use Midjourney, it's not built with like a particular user in mind, particularly not a layperson. So we tried it out for a few hours. I eventually hired an intern to kind of poke around and see if there were use cases for my fund or portfolio companies. But after that initial attempt, I think I'll probably wait until there's some application that's built into my day-to-day.
I see. That makes sense. Jonathan, did you have any thoughts? It looked like you unmuted for a second.
I was just going to add that I think for us, or at least from our perspective, probably there's two empirical things, right? We do see a transition of more mature users from just people flooding in, hobbyists, hackers that were coming in at the beginning. So there's maybe less volume, but the quality is it's now real companies that are coming through our door and talking to us. So that's one thing. And then I'll say another thing empirically from my non-technical friends or older people I know, in community and stuff like that, they when ChatGPT was coming out, everybody was just talking about it. Oh, I used it for this email. I used it to write my daughter's entrance letter to this camp or something like that. And then now, I even had a few people come to me and they're like, yeah, man, ChatGPT didn't do so well on this task or that other task. So now I think the general public that was flooding in has started to see a tiny bit okay, can I use this for my, I have a friend who's going into medical school and he was using this for his application letters or something like that. Yeah, I could use it here. And now he realizes he can't use it everywhere. So there's a little bit of that. But to summarize, definitely a maturity of the users that are coming through our door. A lot more mature companies coming through.
Yeah, thanks for that observation. That's interesting. Now that you mention it, I've noticed something similar. Some of the folks that have signed up for our wait list, early on, they were like, oh, I just saw you in the AI newsletter. And they don't work for a particular company. They're just, kind of messing around. And that's been less true lately. So I think that's an interesting observation. Okay, cool. And so moving on a little bit, I think we kind of already got an answer to this. Okay. It seems like the group consensus is that ChatGPT is basically a demo or a toy. It's not really serious, but I'm curious if people do think there are any use cases where ChatGPT will replace, more traditional uses of the internet. So people were saying this about Google for a while. I think that's worn off, but I'm curious if there is any sliver of use case or usage that'll be displaced by ChatGPT.
Cheating on homework.
All right. Yeah, fair enough. That's yeah, that's about the answer I would expect given what y'all said earlier. That's a good one. What was that? There was something. Oh, wasn't there a professor that asked ChatGPT if people were cheating and it said yes or something, and then it gave people zeros? Did people see this? Did I make this up? Did I hallucinate this? I feel like I saw something like this. All right. Nobody remembers I hallucinated it. Sorry.
It's tricky. I think I honestly can't think of a whole lot of them because in a lot of these cases, right, you're inevitably going to get better by providing better context, and you're only going to do that if you're embedded in actual workflows that have that context. Sure. And so I think the end state is very few things actually have make sense in ChatGPT and not not in a separate tool.
I love it. I wish I met somebody last week who was like, this is the end of the internet. Everybody's just going to use ChatGPT. And I wish that he was in this room so that you guys could duke it out. But anyway, all right, well, moving on. Jonathan, did you look like you
I was going to say, I think for me, at least personally, as someone who codes, I still use ChatGPT for some coding questions.
Sure.
That's honestly, it's a good UX for that, in my opinion.
Yeah.
What about integrating in your IDE? I feel for example, sometimes if I'm writing, I was just playing around with this a few weeks ago. If I'm writing something in a language I'm not that intimately familiar with, and I'm gonna make mistakes, I will paste something into ChatGPT, or I'll ask ChatGPT to write me a boilerplate starting point, right? It'll do that, and then inevitably you reach a point where you get an error, right? And then I go into my terminal and I copy paste the error that I found. And I said, I ran into this error. What do you think I should do? But that step of hopping out of my context into my separate terminal application, copy pasting it back in, not necessarily having a good notion of the history of all that. That's a lot of work I was doing that if this was just in my IDE, this is why I think Copilot and all these other tools are going to be the sensible place to do this, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Fair point, I agree.
We figured it out. ChatGPT is just a demo. It's done. All right, cool. So I mean, we hinted a little bit, I think, at the answer to this question too. But I'm curious, like, what folks, take is on whether current LLM capabilities are like over or underrated. So like Jonathan, you suggested that people are starting to calibrate on this a little bit more. Maybe there's the expectations are not crazy, or maybe it's just right. Like maybe you feel like people understand what these things are now. So let's start there. Like, do we think they're over or underrated currently? Allison, you want to start us? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I think they're overrated in the area of where there's precision that's required in the answer, or some kind of convergent thinking on meaning like thinking about concrete solutions. Interestingly, there's been this emerging category of companies that have been trying to help people get access to their company's data, like to query the data and say, how many of my users gave us, a net promoter score of this, or, what have you. And I think, the expectations there were pretty high. And I think it's hard for these companies to meet those expectations, because really when you're chatting with generative AI, you're chatting with someone who is supremely creative and is more attuned to divergent thinking.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Okay, so overrated in this kind of convergent thinking area specifically. I think that's right. And I like, if I could say a little bit about like what we're doing, like we're trying to use LLMs to help people learn how to use software. And I think a part of the decision to like make that our mission is really a recognition of the limitations of like a more ambitious, like you could try and make LLMs that would like just use the software outright, and that requires a kind of convergent thinking that I just don't think is there yet. And so agreed there. Any other thoughts from other folks?
I totally second this notion. Like, I mean, so I work at a product analytics company, and so like we are constantly exposed to everyone being obsessed with the like text box interface to doing all analytics. And I completely agree that like it's an environment where the cost of hallucination is really high. Like it takes a lot of effort to build trust in data, and it takes very little effort to erode that trust. I do think, for example, tools that have code as an input, or like, for example, like if you have like a SQL runner, right? Or if you have like something that's like really just, has something that's like syntactically specific that the average person may not be that good at, I think LLMs can be really helpful with like giving you a leg up into those kinds of inputs. But even then, it comes with a lot of the same caveats, right? Like I would kind of break that into like that, like an LLM to, for example, input SQL into like a reporting tool, I think is solving two problems, and it's doing one of them a lot better than the other. Like it is solving a workflow automation problem of generate like, functioning SQL code, right? And it's probably going to save you a lot of time there and do a decent job of it. But like, is it referencing the correct events? Is it like, it's like all the little nuanced pieces that actually get you to like, is this the right answer? I think those are the areas where like those kinds of products are probably going to struggle a lot. And so that's why I actually think that they may be overrated out of the box, but underrated if you put in the right investments in creating the right APIs that are underlying, that are exposing access to that data, right? I think if you do a good job of that and you invest a lot in that infrastructure of like, what can I do to give the LLM the cleanest, most reliable data set I can to reduce hallucinations? I think in those respects, people may be underrating how useful it can be in the long run.
I think that's right. And it actually does feel, some of what Zach was just talking about was like kind of investing in like the supporting infrastructure to make these LLMs really effective. And I do think you're right that it could be underrated, like kind of taking that tack. It's kind of like an all or nothing. Like if ChatGPT is an AGI, like I'm not interested, it's like kind of the the sentiment, which is misguided, I think. Awesome. Jonathan, did you want to add anything before we moved on?
No, I think that was a good analysis.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I'm curious, like, actually, this conversation is flowing really nicely with like the flow of questions that I wrote, which I didn't use ChatGPT for, by the way. But I'm curious if you guys have seen like any emerging kind of technical or product patterns to deal with the limitations of LLMs. So like Vijay, you touched a little bit on building supporting infrastructure to make sure the right data is available to the LLMs. But if there are any other patterns, technical or product, that you've seen, would love to see or would love to hear about that.
Well, there's one
Go ahead,
like good prompt engineering, right? So like
Sure.
having feedback loops where like, you know, you see in production where the problem is occurring and then addressing that with whether that be prompt engineering, fine tuning, those types of things. So there's that like, you know, feedback loop in the wild of like, you know, making sure hallucinations don't happen and the system's not questioning or doing the wrong type of data selection. There's also people trying very, very hard to come up with like, you know, test sets and metrics to look at that will kind of like be able to tell you how well this will do in the wild. Although I'm not sure if like we've found something that could work and be as flexible as people need it to be in production, beyond just letting it run in the wild and you know, seeing where it makes mistakes.
So when you say like, you know, looking at the actual behavior in production, you're almost talking about like prompt observability or something like that, like being able to see. That's interesting. Is that a part of what Prompt Layer does?
Yeah, it's a big part of what we do is we have the feedback loop from, you know, iterating on your prompts to seeing how it responds, right, in production.
I see.
So like, for example, if you're a chatbot and you didn't anticipate that customers would, you know, use a specific type of language or something like that, and that triggers this you know, LLM to have a response that you don't want, right? So you see that in production, you didn't anticipate a specific edge case. And now that that edge case occurred, you have that data to adjust your prompt in order to deal with it.
I see. That's interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, you also mentioned test cases. Like I'm hearing that a lot. Like, so one thing we haven't talked about is this idea of prompt drift, where like you have a prompt that works at one point and then it stops working. And I asked Zach about this actually in the last session, and he also brought up this idea of test cases and you know, kind of enabling folks to see when something stops working. So I think those are those definitely seem like patterns, like given that Zach and you brought it up, and then I actually spoke with another person a couple of weeks ago at another conference about like trying to set up some sort of test case or test harness for these sorts of things. Anything from you guys, Vijay or Allison?
You know, on the subject of what's the emerging like technical or product landscape for like solving for hallucinations and other things, I do think it'll be interesting to see what kind of guardrails products are built over time. And, you know, I've talked to some entrepreneurs who I think are interested in solving that as a horizontal problem. Like, how do we just make sure there's like a universal guardrail? I think that's really unlikely. More likely it'll be very catered to specific use cases. For example, I encountered a company called Nomos the other day, which is initially focused on creating compliance guardrails for financial services companies in particular. So let's say you're, you know, consumer, you're interested in certain banking products, you're talking with, you know, chatbot about like what products might be useful. That chatbot needs to say certain things about like the cost of the potential investment opportunities and, you know, what the returns might be, and needs to be in compliance with certain company standards as well as legal standards. That's like a very specific use case. You could imagine financial services companies plugging into some kind of API and in order to access Nomos, and then maybe like, you know, brand, like having the Nomos brand on their company websites so that people know like they're protected by Nomos for this specific thing. But likely it's not just going to be Nomos. There's going to be, you know, other categories of like, you know, sort of guardrails that need to be built. And that might, again, build like great brands around their trustworthiness.
That's interesting. I mean, I think that does fit a little bit too with Zach's talk before. Like there, a lot of the guardrails that he discussed, some of them are generalizable, but they feel like pretty specific to what they're doing. So that makes a lot of sense. Vijay, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think like, so we're a little like earlier, we're in like the POC stage, right? And one of the things that the way we're kind of doing things, kind of to I think one of the points that was made earlier is trying to not test in like demo-aware cases, but instead like kind of creating distributions and actually like creating as large data sets as we can. So for example, like when we look at a given use case, we'll try and generate we'll start with maybe a test set of like one or two examples of something, and then create test data, then create several variations of prompts, right? And then test those different prompts. By the way, we're not at the point yet where now I kind of want to go look up prompt layer now. But like, as we scale, I think we'll get to the point where like right now we're doing a lot of this in a spreadsheet, right? But like over time, as we scale, we'll probably move to more systematically testing out lots of different prompts for that domain. Then if that domain looks promising, start to scale out the data set accordingly, right? And then try to make the data set more and more representative of the real thing. And then like kind of separate from that. And by the way, one other thing is in terms of like the way we're going about building these is as we get directional signal that a certain domain is going to probably click really well, we're using that to actually prioritize the infrastructure investments accordingly, right? So like if you're looking at like in an analytics tool, querying versus data governance, if the data governance use cases actually seem more promising and reliable, we will prioritize building more robust APIs for data governance over querying, right? Like we haven't gotten to like a lot of those decision points yet, but like that's how we're thinking about it and approaching it, is like being kind of systematic, because it is really like, if there are any product people watching it, it's like very easy to like toss 50% of your roadmap and like just be like, LLMs are cool, let's go do it, right? And then you end up like really sacrificing a lot of impact. And so I think it's very important to like test methodically as you go, because the technology is evolving really fast, but it's also at the same time really easy to burn time on something that doesn't bear fruit when it's actually very easy to test.
Sure. So, and just to be clear, you're prioritizing the infrastructure investments so that you can provide the proper context for the LLM.
Exactly. But we're manually doing that in the near term for like proof of concepts, right?
Sure. Do things that don't scale, right? Nail it and scale it, right? Like that kind of thing. Yeah.
And also like the other lever too that we look at is like, for the same task, how do cheaper models versus more expensive models perform?
Sure.
Although it's interesting too, is like those gaps are starting to go down, right? Like a lot of the more performant, more capable models are getting exponentially cheaper. So
well, yeah, and also, I mean, there are some cases, like I talked about this in my talk, like there are some cases where like 3.5 does better than 4, like, and so it's like it's not even like true that 4 is always better. Like it's like gets the right answer and it's cheaper, is what I mean.
By the way, I do see one common pattern, at least in like products that have productionized these things. Like I have seen like, so either you take, I think everyone is kind of on the approach of like, I think most of what is out there is hitting OpenAI's APIs, right? Like it's the fastest way to get into production, right? Fastest way to like to ship something reasonable. And I think there's kind of like a couple categories. Like one is they are just going for it with like a full chat domain, and like it's if chat is the relevant interface and domain for what you're doing, like maybe like support automation type things, then like they're just sort of doing it very directly. The other type is like they're basically like using oh shit, I totally forgot what the other type was. I'll think about that a little more. I totally forgot.
No worries. Yeah. It's tough. This stuff's complicated. I think we can move on to the next question, and hopefully Vijay will think of it before we get too deep into it.
I got 7 minutes.
What's that?
I got several minutes to try to remember.
Yeah. That's right. I'm curious, like what Vijay, you hinted at this just now, like an obvious mistake to make with LLMs and product strategy is to just like throw away your roadmap and like build the shiny things, like and not really be thoughtful about it. So that's kind of an obvious mistake, but I'm curious, like what other mistakes people are seeing as folks try to incorporate LLMs into their products, or, Allison, maybe you could give more of the mistakes that you're seeing AI native startups do. Maybe you could give some of that perspective. Yeah,
I think actually related to what Vijay was saying, I think there are a number of companies that might have gotten started in 2022. So they're not, you could call them like pre-chat GPT wave, but they're still young companies that were in their pursuit of product market fit. And then the GPT thing became, evident to everyone. And they felt the need, like their board was saying, you have to look into this, you have to figure out how to use GPT. So they diverted their focus away from the search for product market fit toward how to just make sure that they have GPT like embedded in their product in some way, like maybe a chat interface. And I think that's a distraction, like I think if there's a real way that you can take out costs for your customers or, draw attention in a big way to your app. Because actually, I think there are a lot of products that were built before the GPT era, but then suddenly got traction because they use GPT. Like actually Gamma.app is a great example of this. They were founded, I think, in 2021, but then got like 10,000 new users per day in the several weeks after their launch a couple months ago, because they launched, they relaunched basically like with generative AI. So like that's an opportunity. Taking out meaningful costs or adding a lot of value for your customers through GPT, like meaningful opportunity. But if it's not on your path, just searching for product market fit, it's distraction, in my opinion.
Sure.
Actually, like one thing I'll build on there that, by the way, I remember the thing I was saying earlier.
Okay. If you can work it in artfully, don't use ChatGPT to help.
Yeah, exactly. No, the other pattern I was saying, which is kind of like not super surprising, is I think a lot of people are trying opt-in versus opt-out, or like default interfaces that like you. So like instead of like summarizing everything on a page automatically for you, they will like make you ask for a summary. Because that not only gives them a simple feedback loop of like, is this delivering value, which I think that's actually a very good thing. It's also controlling costs. But like, so that's just like another pattern I've kind of observed and seen in different tools.
Got it. And I can see how that could be used just to like understand, the limitations of the LLM. Like if it's not providing value, people are not going to keep opting in.
Exactly.
So you can kind of, I mean, we're thinking about something like that too for Atlas, right? Like we're guiding people to the right place in an application. And if they're not repeat users of that, that's a pretty clear indication that we're, we got it wrong or whatever. So yeah, that makes sense.
But going back to your other question about like, what are some mistakes that people are making? I think, Matt, like one thing we were talking about earlier today was like a lot of these, like I think like AI platform companies. One of the things that I find like fascinating to look at is like, so I think there's like two categories that maybe have two different types of mistakes. One is like the AI platform companies that are potentially building the feature of a larger platform company, and I think you kind of have to ask yourself like what are you doing that is like making it like what is your defensibility, right, in this situation? I think the other category is like people who are building end user applications that are basically saying, okay, we're going to come in and disrupt like X type of like marketing content tool or whatever, right? Like, and we're going to take an LLM based approach, right? Now, I think the advantage that these companies have over the existing companies is that like the existing companies were maybe created in a world where they assumed they had no LLMs for content creation, et cetera. So they would have staffed up and accordingly built out a very like high marginal cost approach. Whereas like you have the opportunity to disrupt on cost if you can create something that's sufficiently high quality with a lot of automation, right? But that also means your go-to-market can't be like, sales led, right? I think like you really want to, if your ultimate advantage is going to be much better margins, you would better be going to market in a way that is much lower margin, right? So I think like some of these companies that are like, okay, we're going to do an AI-based approach to X, Y, or Z, and we're competing with, like you're making like a marketing tool and you're competing with like Canva. Like Canva can like wake up one day and decide I'm going to go build an LLM based approach and they have a massive distribution advantage, right? And so, how are you going to counteract that, right? Like, and is your whole company, including the go-to-market motion, actually taking into account that advantage? I think that's something that's going to be really interesting to see with a lot of these companies that are cropping up, because they're under a lot of pressure with all this like venture funding that they're raising to grow very quickly. And it's like really easy to just be like, okay, the best way for me to grow quickly is to hire a sales team, which then fundamentally changes your unit economics, so you don't have that advantage that you would have had otherwise. So I think like I'm a big proponent of like in these LLM companies, if their advantage is going to be costs, like you got to also sell in a way that's cost efficient.
Love it. We only have 1 minute left. Time flew by. But I love the comment. I've been thinking about this a lot, Vijay. We're wrapping up around like thinking about this kind of stuff. But so let's ask one more thing. I'm curious, like maybe we could just share like resources that we consume for kind of keeping up with, what's going on with LLMs, product strategy. Like Are there things that people kind of look at that's really useful? Maybe we'll end on that note.
My quick tip would be, I think there are so many newsletters nowadays that are talking about LLMs. So, you could kind of pick your favorite one. I think what's potentially more useful is trying to use as many products as you can yourself, like try it out, experiment, get the firsthand experience, and you'll develop the skills as well that we're all going to need in this new economy.
I love it. Taste the soup. It's still a value at Heap, Vijay? Yeah, taste the soup. Cool. Any other thoughts on resources for like kind of staying up to date on this?
I think Twitter is pretty strong. A lot of noise there. A lot of noise.
X, right?
I completely forgot about Twitter, X, Threads, whatever, Mastodon or whatever the other one was called. There's a lot of people putting interesting stuff there, and then I kind of use that as a way to like bubble up. Okay, now I need to try this out. Because there's like every other day, there's a new library, a new this, a new that, a new technique. And then like if it has staying power on Twitter, then you're like, okay, time to block off some time on my calendar and be like, let's dig deep, right?
Yeah, nice. Vijay?
I like paper summaries on YouTube. That's like some of like AI Explained is a good one. There's like a whole bunch of them, but like I think the ones that are just like they're not like opinion thought pieces. They're just like a paper was published. Here's a summary of the paper. I found it out myself on like 1,000 examples. Here's what my data set said. I think that's good. If you have a few minutes, it can get you through a lot of content.
Got it. Yeah, I'll quickly share. Oh, go ahead, Allison. Go ahead. Or it looks like you unmuted. Oh, okay. I'll quickly share. Like I actually have found. We didn't get to talk about this, but I think like the fundamentals of product strategy, I don't think have really changed, even though LLMs exist in the world. And so I've actually just found it really useful to just like revisit some like stuff. Like 7 Powers is like a really interesting book on product and business strategy written by a former Stanford economist. And now he's like doing VC stuff. But I'm finding that stuff extremely useful as I think about the shifting landscape with LLMs. Like the fundamentals are the same, but there's like some stuff that's changing up here, but knowing the kind of principles and fundamentals has been really useful. So I will share that as my resource. Cool. I think we are out of time. Thank you guys so much. This was a delight. I think Erin's going to come on here and there she is.
All right. First off, this is a great panel. I learned a lot and can +1 the panel review. There are paper reviews on YouTube because that's actually my background noise a lot of the days is like, gotta get this paper. Like it's the only way I feel like I can stay up on top.